Hello and welcome to Advanced English Composition. Again, Professor Kent Lee here. First, let's talk about the midterm that's coming up. It will probably be in early May. It may not be during the actual midterm week. I think with the online class system, you probably it would be good to have some flexibility for this kind of assignment, and you might have midterm tasks in your other courses. For this class, I'm going to give you a little essay assignment for your midterm, and we are going to kind of build up to that. I'll give you some topics in the maybe the assignment space on the website, the LMS, actually fairly soon, probably by the next class, before the Friday class. I'll give you a selection of topics to choose from, and I'll ask you to start kind of outlining them. You pick one question and you write your response to it, and I'm going to first ask you to outline your contents and your sources. Then after I kind of give you feedback and approve it, then I'm going to say, okay, write it up and turn it in for the midterm. So I might make the due date for the midterm essay maybe a little bit later than the other midterms for the other courses. So I'll give you maybe a selection of several different interesting topics that are kind of academic topics. I'm not going to expect full academic sources for this kind of thing. We talked about professional sources and academic sources last week and so forth. So I will give you a selection of topics where you can probably find good professional sources, or maybe relatively lighter academic English sources, academic sources. But I'm not going to expect you to, hit the really heavy academic research publications to do this kind of task. So to prepare you for that, we're going to talk today about introductions and essay structure, and a little bit about source use again. We'll touch on source use again. Come back to that a little bit later. So I have provided a PDF version of my course booklet, and the syllabus is in there, by the way, too. Some things will continue to change as we continue with the online system, class system. But I'm going to ask you to look at page 60 in my course booklet. So in one of the announcements on the LMS, I posted a link to a PDF version of the course booklet that you can download. And again, don't print it out, it's going to change. But on page 60, there is a little bit about introductions. And we're also going to refer back to the essay samples that we talked about before. So, page 60, here's some kind of opening questions in the first section, 5.6.1, sample introductions. I'm going to have you look at some sample introductions in a few minutes from this section. First, we're going to go back and look at the previous essays from last week that are in the book. So first, some guiding questions. Are these effective introductions? For college papers, would these be good or effective introductions? Are they clear? Are they focused? Is there some content that would be better left out, omitted? And number 4 is kind of relevant to the examples we'll talk about a little bit later. So for the essays we looked at last week, the short sample essays, 1, are they effective? 2, are they clear, specific, and focused? 3, is there some stuff that doesn't belong? Number 5, do they follow any of the following strategies? So in number 5, there's a list of some kinds of strategies, and which of these are maybe more suited for informal papers and which are more suited for formal academic papers. We'll talk about that. But in the essay samples that we discussed last week, I want you to go back and look at the introductions and discuss them with somebody for a few minutes. So the essay sample number 1, so in the book, the current PDF version of the book, that is the research program application essay we talked about before, which is now page 51, and the essay sample 2 on page 53 about language education in Korea. So I want you to pause the video and look at these questions on page 60 and look at those past two essay samples, look at the intro paragraphs and talk about them. So pause the video, look at those, critique them, talk about them with somebody, and we'll come back. And we're back, and the first sample essay from last week, the Research Program Application by Herbert McGruber. We kind of criticized the introduction earlier. Let's look at the strategy. I would say that the beginning strategy in the first sentence is kind of a hook. It's a very bad one. It's a very poorly done hook. It's an attempt at a hook, getting the reader's attention. Do you think that academic papers usually use hooks? What do you think? Well, probably not. A hook is something that maybe you were taught in a writing class before, and it's maybe more suited to first-year college papers or a paper in an introductory college course. But beyond that, we don't really use hooks that much. It's more of an informal device, some way of getting the reader's attention. And certainly a common dictionary definition for a common word is really lame. It's really weak. It's very ineffective. I want to say it's stupid, because this really is. Citing a common dictionary definition or a common fact or something from Wikipedia, it's really weak. This is a very weak introduction. And then the writer in the first paragraph perhaps tries to lay out his objectives. So 5G, I'm going to probably, the writer's trying to lay out the objectives of the essay. Does the writer do a good job of that? Does the writer effectively lay out his objectives? I don't think so. It's not clear what his specific objectives are. I think this lacks focus. I think it's not very clear. What really is your motivation, your objective in this research? Well, first, what is your research project about? And what's the motivation or the rationale or the objective or the goal behind it? The reader would really want to know. And if the reader doesn't get that in the first paragraph, then the reader is not going to fully pay attention to the rest of the essay. And the focus and objectives are especially clear in explaining the maybe the project and the goals, and then the thesis statement. A thesis statement is kind of a main purpose statement or objective statement for the whole essay. And there really isn't a clear thesis statement. The writer ends this paragraph with some flowery, kind of promising language, trying to talk about how promising maybe this opportunity would be. But there's nothing specific. In this case, a thesis statement might be include the objective and or why the writer is qualified to do this project, because the writer is asking for admission to a research project. So in terms of a value or justification or purpose or objectives, that's really lacking here. The writer attempts to do that, but the writer fails. It's a very weak example. 53, I think it's page 53 in the, let me see here. Yeah, 53, language education in Korea. This begins with an anecdote, a personal story. So your own story or from somebody that you know. Is this a good opening for an academic essay? I don't think so. Again, this would be probably appropriate for a first-year college paper, a paper in an introductory course, beginning course, perhaps. But otherwise, beyond that, this is not really good for a college paper. It's this too first-person style. It's too personal, too subjective. It's subjective. It's not objective. It's subjective. The anecdote. This anecdote might be good if you're giving a public speech, if you're writing an informal essay, or something like that. But here it doesn't work. It kind of doesn't go with the rest of the essay. The rest of the essay feels more professional, but the beginning does not feel professional, and so the reader is not going to get a good impression from the beginning. There's a lot of first person, and by the way, this is my own example. This was many years ago. I was in Seoul. I was teaching English in Seoul, and I was in the subway station, and this old guy came up to me, and there are occasionally a few weird people in the subway here. This hasn't happened actually for a while, but it used to happen a bit more often. Maybe some socially awkward person wants to start a conversation with a foreigner. And this guy, he just came up to me on the subway platform and said, "Can I help you?" So he's assuming, oh, I'm a foreigner. I must be some poor, lost, stupid foreigner. I wasn't. I was living in the neighborhood and commuting to my work. And he starts talking and talking and talking about, as this essay explains, what he did with the English program and at a school, and he, in a way that I think devalued English by forcing it on to people as aggressively as apparently he did. I think it devalues English education, and it devalues other languages. Other languages and other subjects are important too. Yes, you need English, but you also need another language too to function in this world. Japanese, Chinese, German, French, Spanish, those are important too. So I found this guy's attitude offensive, and the way he kept talking and talking and talking while we were on the subway, and he would not shut up. And finally I had to change trains, and thank God I never saw him again. Occasionally there are a few weird people here in the subway. And it's perhaps true in any big city. I've had unusual experiences on subways in Paris and New York City and stuff. But not too much though. Okay, now are the objectives clear? Once you get past that weak anecdote, there is a clear thesis statement about what the writer's main argument is and how the writer is going to explain it. That is, policies need to be tailored to the student's needs. And then several of the main arguments that will be developed in the paper are also included in the intro paragraph here, not focusing just on English, not just American English, not imposing the same requirements on all Korean students. It could probably be more clear if this paragraph, this intro paragraph, specifically stated that it's talking about university education, because a better focus for the whole essay is better. If you're just talking about education, English education in general, it's going to be too much. Focusing on maybe university education would be better. It seems to be the focus of the whole essay. It would be better if that's clearer in the introduction, unless you have some context that tells you the focus. So there were a few things that did not belong in both these samples. This essay could maybe begin by stating the problem, or giving some background information. When you give background information, it should be fairly specific, fairly informative. It should not be a common fact. Years ago, I was teaching a class, and I asked students to write an essay about English education in Korea, critique one particular problem, and I got some essays that began with kind of very general or vague introductions about how English is a global language. That's kind of common knowledge, and that is not effective in an English academic essay. It might be appropriate in the writing style of other cultures, in the academic writing style of East Asian cultures, perhaps, but not so much in English or Western academic culture. Or intros talking about how English is so hard for Koreans. Okay, yeah, we know that. You should have something more specific. We know that English is difficult for Koreans. We know that the world is a global village. We know that English is a global language. You don't need to say that in an intro. Get to the point or provide some interesting background information that leads to your main point, or an interesting observation about the problem that leads to the main point, or identify the problem and then lead to your main point, your thesis, clearly in the intro. So your intro should be to the point. It should be more concise. So those are some issues with these introductions. In the next section on starting on page 60, I have some sample introductions, and most of these are real actual examples from college or even graduate school papers, students in a master's program. Some are by Korean writers studying at an American university. Some are by native English writers. And I want you to look at these. Are these effective introductions? Can you tell which ones were written by Korean writers and which ones were not? Are these effective? Are these good introductions? What kind of strategy? So question number 5, what kind of strategy is used? Are there some things that don't belong? Are they focused and specific enough? So pause the video, look at these examples. So starting from example 1, low pressure synthesis of diamond on graphite. That sounds fun. And on to 2, 3, 4, 5 examples. So pause the video and discuss these examples for a few minutes. And we're back. So let's talk about these. Number 1, low pressure synthesis of diamond on graphite. Was this really fun to read? How many of you liked this? How many of you thought this was a good introduction? Raise your hand if you think it's good. Okay, now raise your hand if you don't think it's good, if you don't like it. And why don't you like it? When I have students look at this in a real class, more often the non-science students will say that they don't like it, which is understandable. There's some typical aspects of science writing here. It's very dense, it's very dry, it's very direct. It's very direct and to the point. Not only is that a characteristic of science, but also a lot of science journals, academic research journals for science. They're hard to get your papers in, accepted there. So you have to make your papers as direct and short and concise as possible. And that's reflected in the introduction here. It starts out very directly, and if I asked you which is the thesis statement, it's hard to say without reading the whole article. The first sentence or the last sentence probably could be thesis statements, and in science writing, it would not be unusual for the first sentence of the intro to be the thesis statement. So this is kind of a summary of what they did in their experiment and a statement of the implications. So maybe the main implications that could be the thesis statement in the last sentence, perhaps. So especially if you're a humanities person, you won't like this style of writing, but for science, this is pretty good writing. It is actually well done writing. Do you think this is written by a Korean or a native English speaker? It's actually written by a Korean graduate student, probably a master's or PhD student in the US. And this is something the student submitted for an assignment in an English writing course. If you're a Ford student and you go to study at a university in another country, for example in North America, the first thing they might do to you as a new student is make you take language placement test, and based on that they might make you take a writing course for foreign students or a speaking course for foreign students, and that's where this came from. You can tell because that this is a Korean writer, not from the general style. The general style is pretty good. This is good science style, good scientific style. The main giveaway that this is a Korean writer is that there are a couple of minor grammatical mistakes. What I particularly notice is the could, C-O-U-L-D. So the second line or the third sentence, we could find etching of graphite. And the last sentence, we could successfully explain it without the thermodynamic paradox. It should be the thermodynamic paradox. Could is sometimes misused by Korean writers, I've noticed, because some of your teachers taught you wrong. The default meaning of, or the most kind of basic meaning of could is not necessarily past tense. Now, could did develop, in the history of the English language, could developed as a past tense of can. I can, I could. But its primary use in modern English as is a future or hypothetical. We could do this. For example, we could do the experiment, conditional or hypothetical. We could do the experiment if we had the research funding for it, or if we had a good lab to do this. We could do this experiment. So in this case, we could find etching. It would be better to say we found etching, or we were able to find etching. A clear past tense verb. We found, or we were able to find. And instead of we could successfully explain, we could say we can successfully explain. Or if you want to emphasize the past tense, we were able to successfully explain it. That would be clearer. So could is not necessarily past tense. It can be past tense if there is a past tense verb or a time phrase or something that puts it clearly in the past tense. When I was young, I could lift 20 kilograms. Something like a time expression or time phrase or something that clearly makes it past, so it forces a past interpretation of the could. Or a negative, especially in a past context, a negative. We couldn't lift it. It was too heavy. We could not lift it. That would make it past tense. So otherwise, the default interpretation of could is hypothetical. Okay, number 2, integration of game attributes into travel decision aid systems. I'll let you know this is another Korean graduate student. This is in a social science program of some kind, a master's student. The emergence of technology such as the internet has changed not only the way of communication. Is that a necessary sentence? Considering that the readers, the potential readers of this would be educated people familiar with a particular academic field, this is not informative. This is really weak. It's uninteresting. It's obvious. It's kind of an obvious fact. You don't want to start your introductions with obvious facts. So this is kind of weak. However, if you strike that sentence out and begin with the rest, the second sentence, recent research on travel information search process, maybe processes, that would be a good start. That starts with kind of background information, but it's background that's not too familiar, it's not too boring, it's interesting, it's not something that all readers would really know. They would be kind of probably familiar with the general field, but not that particular area of research. So it starts with a particular research area. It identifies a research area and starts talking about past research. Now, in the introduction, would you want to talk that much about past research and citing sources and such like this? This cites a lot of past sources, and it gives kind of a long, for an intro paragraph, a fairly long summary of past research and researchers. Would you want to do this in an intro paragraph? In some more technical context, it might work, but in this case, I don't think it works as well. It would be better to maybe summarize the past research and theoretical background, I think, more concisely, more briefly, without citing the sources here. You don't really need to cite sources in the intro paragraph. In some academic papers, long academic papers, you could have maybe a long introduction consisting of several paragraphs, and it might be possible there. But in this case, if it's a one-paragraph introduction, like in most college papers, I would skip citing all the sources. I would give a more brief summary of the key ideas and the key findings in the field, and then lay out what you're going to do. Then some more details about the background could be presented in the next paragraph, maybe in a background paragraph. We talked about background paragraphs. The following discusses characteristics. It's okay, some people do that in academic writing. I prefer not to. So this is kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines from the bottom. It's kind of the last sentence. The following, meaning the following paper, discusses the characteristics. It's kind of dry, and some academic writers do that. It's not bad, but I think it's better to avoid that when possible, and simply some academic people teach their students it's good to write like that. So I'm not going to say it's bad. I just think it's often possible to avoid saying, like, this paper is going to discuss X, Y, and Z. It's very dry. It's very formulaic, like a formula, and it might be done in more higher level academic writing. But I think you could maybe avoid this by using the passive voice, passive verbs. Travel, information, search, processing, game attributes will be discussed, and a model will be proposed with da-da-da. And I think this sentence here could be a little bit, I think it could be worded more clearly so you can kind of see what's the thesis, and then the overview of the main points. The thesis, which is that a particular model is going to be proposed. That should be maybe the key or the core part of your sentence, your thesis statement sentence. The fact that after reviewing characteristics of travel, an integrated model will be proposed. And if that's kind of highlighted as the main clause, the key part of the sentence, that would be a stronger thesis. And then the rest could be kind of like by highlighting or by discussing flow experience, or something like that, to make it clear that those are some of the key points supporting the thesis. So I think that could be worded more clearly. Otherwise, this intro paragraph is not bad. And this is written by a Korean graduate student in the US, and it's actually not bad. All right, we have next example 3 in your version of the book, Moral Perfection in Young Goodman Brown. So here we have a more humanities type paper. This is maybe a freshman college paper by probably an American student in an American literature course. And Nathaniel Hawthorne is a famous American writer, and Young Goodman Brown is a famous short story in American literature. So, is this an effective introduction? I don't know. I think if it's a familiar story and it's a literature class, and the potential readers would be other literature students and the professor or professors in such a class, maybe you don't need to explain a lot about what happens in the story. That part, maybe the first couple of sentences could be a little more concise. We must look at how Goodman Brown reacts. And okay, I think a more interesting statement could be made. Not just we must look at, it's kind of like not very insightful. We must look at how the character reacts. Well, that's something you generally do in literary analysis anyway. To determine what Hawthorne thinks about morality, again, I think that's not a very insightful statement. Maybe Hawthorne's views about human morality, or that could be worded a bit more clearly without saying, what Hawthorne thinks about morality. That's not very clear, or it's not very precise academically. Later on, the writer says, I think we can conclude. Again, that's kind of subjective or referring to the self, and that's not really good. And why does the writer of this intro say we can conclude Hawthorne believes such and such? It doesn't sound like a very deep analysis or very insightful one. I'm not sure if this really comes from the story. So the last part, he expresses skepticism towards Puritan religious attitudes and practice. I think that part's good. That's pretty true. But I think what the student writer is trying to infer about Hawthorne's beliefs about morality could be said in a more interesting way, or in a more precise or deeper way. It could be thought out better generally. So it's okay, but this could be done better. Example 4, food irradiation. That's using radiation to preserve food instead of chemicals. And this was kind of an issue in the 70s, 80s, and 1990s. So this is an old example. So notice how the writer starts, in almost every part of the world, people daily protect their vital food supplies. Oh, that's so boring, gosh. A comment on the obvious. That's a very weak beginning. It's a common fact, common knowledge, general knowledge. And the reader is going to think the writer doesn't have anything interesting to say, because it starts out with a very common statement. It's not very interesting. Okay, for most Americans, why just Americans? Why do we need to focus on Americans? I think a more universal wording would be better for modern people, people in industrialized nations. That would be better. Okay. While there is no precise information on just how much of the world's food supply is lost to spoilage or going bad, well, why don't you look it up? Okay, give us some interesting, you could at least look up some interesting data or statistics. That would at least help. Here the writers are saying, I don't know, but I guess it's a problem. Look it up. Do a search. Find a decent source, at least a professional source. Not just how much food, but maybe something more interesting about food spoilage in the economic costs or the environmental costs. Something more interesting than that. It's clear the losses are enormous. Okay, yeah, but say something more interesting. Look up some good information and say something more interesting, especially in less developed countries. You can at least afford the waste. Okay, you could again look up information on less developed countries and some more information about the problem there in those countries, as well as the fact that they have warmer climates. The thorn, that's a source citation. Okay, I'm not sure if that's really needed in an introduction though. Citable information maybe should go in a background paragraph or in the body paragraphs. Because the world's population is growing at a rapid pace, we need to find viable solutions to the problem of waste and decay. That's kind of a boring thesis. It doesn't present a very clear idea, because the paper is probably supposed to talk about food irradiation. The thesis would be much better if it actually proposed some scheme for food irradiation in underdeveloped countries, if that's what the writer wants to do. Because it seems that maybe is where the writer is going. So a clear statement of the thesis, okay, would really be better here. The thesis statement here is quite generic. It's quite general, it's quite uninteresting, and it doesn't give us any idea where the rest of the paper is going. This is clearly a first-year college paper because it's trying to use really weak, it uses a lot of weak or general statements, and it doesn't really come out and present a clear thesis or objective or goal, or it doesn't really have much focus. The last example, this is kind of a long introduction, This is an old example, by the way. You would definitely want to revise this. It begins with what is now really common knowledge about the role of computers in society and in schools. I think that could be left out, omitted, or it could be revised and made more interesting and up to date. The second paragraph, so again, maybe some of this content could be stripped out, and this could be made into a more effective single paragraph introduction. A multi-paragraph introduction is something you might see in more advanced academic texts, more technical texts. But especially if it's more of a college level paper or beginning master's program, here a single paragraph introduction would be better. It would be better to clearly divide this into maybe two paragraphs. One paragraph is a proper introduction that presents a thesis, and then the next paragraph could be a background paragraph where then the writer cites some sources. There are a lot of sources cited, some background research, but it's just briefly, it's just like thrown down in there. These sources, Gupser, Hinton suggested, Foster and Clean, 1982 cite, blah, blah, blah. Okay, each source is maybe cited and explained in one sentence. And that might be more appropriate in the body or in a background paragraph, but not so much for an introduction. The last part is maybe a thesis. The purpose of this study, last paragraph, was to ascertain the effect of microcomputer assisted instruction as opposed to lecture discussion techniques. Okay. From the beginning, you don't know that this is about agriculture education, and I think that could be clear from the beginning. The writer's going to talk about agriculture education, and so it would be maybe, I think the first paragraph could be cut out. This could start with maybe a brief description of the research issue, using computers in agriculture education or vocational education, and then the thesis, the purpose of the study, and a rationale this topic was identified. That could be maybe come before the thesis. A lot of the content in the second and third paragraphs could be moved to a background paragraph after the intro paragraph and after the thesis. I think that's better background material, where you kind of survey the field and you survey key discoveries or key ideas in that particular research topic. That would be better. So this is maybe for academic writing, especially in a graduate school program, not bad, but this really could be organized better for the sake of the readers, especially if somebody happens to find this on the internet who is looking for information on the topic, but is not interested in the details of all this research. It would be better to kind of get their interest with a more readable introduction here. And so this could be improved. This could have better flow and better focus throughout it. Okay, so that's enough about introductions. Again, this would be much better to do in a real class, but again, this online education, it's kind of a sacrifice that we have to make all over the world, and there's not much we can do about it. So because of the limitations, I'm not going to be too strict in grading your midterm essays, because these circumstances are less than ideal. If you look at the back of my book, the course packet, the PDF that I sent you, by the way, I do have a section, it's major written assignments, general grading criteria. You can look at that as you do your midterm essay. So I will probably before next class, post some suggested topics in the LMS, and I'm going to then ask you to submit, to choose your topic and to submit an outline through a Google form as a minor assignment. An outline and kind of sketch out your introduction and your outline or your main points for the paper. And I'll try to give you an interesting choice of kind of academic related topics that are relevant to you and that are interesting also for you, hopefully. So that's it for today. Next time we will either talk more about using sources or we will start talking about argumentation. I'm not sure about the order, but one of those things we will do on Friday. So until then, see you later. Have a good day.